Okay. Hello, my name is Nakadah Walker. I'm presenting a history of silenced voices. I don't have, a nice presentation, but well, um, well, the past two presentations have been more focused on like the books themselves. Mine is a little bit more focused on writing. Um, it's a really powerful thing writing is. It creates these amazing worlds and it spreads knowledge and it gives an audience to voices that often aren't heard. And it's a tool, an art, and a passion for a lot of people. It can also create blockades against new voices that have different perspectives. Um, and the modern freedom to write has a history of oppression, a history of people being locked out of reading and writing, access to literacy, and access to even basic things that people now have access to, like the Bible or, just books in general. Um, there's a history of like silence where the thoughts and words of certain people were blocked from being published or heard outside of themselves. It's definitely not a comfortable history. It's very dark and full of racism, sexism, and classism. So there's an anthropologist, and I'm probably going to butcher his name. It's, I believe, Michael Rolfe Trelew. He wrote a book called Silencing the Past. And in his book, he talks about how, like, there are parts of history that get buried under the common narrative of whatever it may be, and there's silences everywhere. And a lot of his examples talk about wars or battles or things like that, major like historical events that have underlying stories that are never heard. But there are parts of history, like these parts of history aren't any less important. They're just kind of pushed to the background because the victors didn't, consider them important, or the people whose stories there aren't the ones who were in power at the time that they were being, told. There are silent narratives everywhere, just as there's history everywhere. It's constantly, new silences are being found or created because there's always that there's always people who are, coming up with their own interpretations of narratives. Access to information has been a really long-standing issue. There was a time, as I believe you said, where like all of the texts were in a language people, didn't have access to, couldn't speak, couldn't read even to, get to it. And before the spread of literacy, most people had to rely on others to pass on written words. And the history we have of those time periods has the potential to be incredibly skewed to the view of the people who were doing that, like translating. Despite the silence that covers history, some people manage to kind of break through it and be heard. But in a few of the ways they have to do that is like sometimes they're, thought of as crazy, or they're rich enough that, people just ignore like their oddities. One example of this is a woman who lived in the 14th century in the United Kingdom. Her name was Julian of Norwich, and she wrote I believe it's a book, maybe not quite a book, but it's called The Revelations of Divine Love. And it's one of the top theological like works from that time. She was an anchoress, which is essentially a religious hermit. She lived in like a little shack. She never saw anyone. She never really like went anywhere. She was a hermit. And that gave her the ability to write this and kind of be allowed to just do what she wanted, because she was away from society and like in a lot of ways considered kind of crazy. Like she was very ill when she was about 30, and a religious person came to do her last rites, and she supposedly went into some sort of like almost coma like state and had visions, and then this her revelations of divine love is her writing down those visions and discussing them. We actually don't know much else about her. Even the name Julian of Norwich isn't her name. She was given that due to her work at St. Julian's Church in Norwich, England. But so yeah, like she was honestly kind of just buried like in the background of history, because like she was considered kind of crazy, although there were people who would go to her because she was an ingress and ask for like religious advice. Her work actually was not published until the 17th century. It was, I believe, rediscovered and then published under a couple of different names before it got to the name Revelations of Divine Love. And although like her work now is considered like really important, like theologically, it still tends to end up in the background of works like the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, even though they were written around the exact same time. And like when they're taught about like in literature classes or anything, most classrooms focus on works like Chaucer's over hers, unless it's like very specifically focused on like women like literature. Literacy is a really large component to freedom, like to be able to access this like broad span of information that like exists now is directly like rooted in the ability to read, because being able to read now means that you can find pretty much anything, as long as you have access to, you know, libraries or the internet or whatever, which are their own issues of access, but reading really is a big part of that. Silences in history aren't always battles and wars. Sometimes they're, you know, one writer being listened to over another because of their gender or race or the like socioeconomic background they have. And it can definitely affect like how people see what they're writing and think about it. And they can be like silences can be as big or small as any part of history, because in history there's, you know, tiny minute details that may not seem important, but they can end up being incredibly important later. Julian of Norwich is far from the only woman to have written historically. There are like other examples, but they're kind of hard to find because they weren't like considered important as writers historically. And though she's one of the most well-known, she continues to remain kind of like partially buried in history, and kind of buried underneath this plethora of male authors from the time. And people who learn about her and like speak about her, the knowledge of like what she wrote is kind of slowly being pulled out of history and back into like the forefront of conversation, which is definitely helping to bring more more of those kind of hidden narratives back to the forefront and out of the silence. Does anybody have any questions? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I don't want to like, you said that so well, and I don't want to like try and like re-say that. Yeah.
As I've been mentioning throughout the Q&As and the seminars, there's your presentation, your themes in your presentation really go back to inequalities in our society and power structures that have been perpetuated for centuries. Your mentioning of that author who was a woman that wrote that novel, or wrote that, I would say manuscript or something along those lines is probably the better way to describe that, how it was shadowed by powerful white men, wealthy at that. The question is, how is that continuing to be perpetuated in 2021? How are we contributing to that perpetuation? How are we going to advocate against the perpetuation of those inequalities? How are we going to advocate for individuals who need that, who have language barriers, who have income barriers, other inequalities that they may possess because of their place in society according to the structures that we've created?
I definitely think it's a good question. And I do think it is something that's like getting better, because we are seeing more forms that are in Spanish, or more, access to translations, or things like that. And plus, I know you have a large interest in first generation students. Like, there are things like Trio now that help students, get access to information and things they don't know how. And there's a lot of like, I know the library has a lot of resources of like help if you need like questions that you need answering and stuff. And so I think that there's definitely there's a lot more change that's been happening. I mean, it can always get better, but and like even books being published now, there's a lot more people who are looking for diverse authors and stuff. And so it gets better. But like I said, it can always get better.
So it's not as pessimistic as people like to make it out, because there's a lot of people out there who like to make this into a pessimistic argument that nothing can be done.
I think that it is easy to be really pessimistic about it, because I mean, there are so many, like, there's a whole huge history of like knowledge that's been lost or ignored or destroyed or whatever, just because of who wrote it, or was never published or written down because they didn't have access to it. And so like, there is a big gap in what could be there. And so it's easy to be pessimistic, but I do think that it's not necessarily like it always has to stay that way. Does anybody else have a question or comment? Yes. Do you want to? I always feel really bad trying to like sum up what y'all are saying, because like
So just for like me personally, I've been trying to kind of do my part to read more stuff from like own voices authors to help extend some of that limelight, that spotlight, and that it gives them power, I think, to be heard and listened to, and then have your interpretation of their work like spread and kind of distributed to the masses just by, you having read it, having thought about it, digested it, and, put it forward again. But is there anything in your mind that else that like we or I could be doing other than just trying to like diversify my reading by specifically seeking out works published by own voices authors, whether that be people who are talking about a specific race, religion, anyone who's like kind of experienced something that I haven't. Does that make sense?
I mean, I think that's like a really good step. And I think that a lot of people like don't think about the fact that they're not like reading diverse things. So I think it's cool that like you are. Um, I mean, personally, I mean, like I'm a history major. I love the history of it. So like looking at the history and like seeing where those gaps are and kind of like realizing that there is a lot of things that go into why there's just now starting to be a lot more like diverse authors, and well, why is there more diversity, and like kind of, as I think seeing the importance of it like is a good thing to have already been doing, and to like, you know, look at those like spaces and be like, hey, you know, I can never, you know, really understand this, but I would like to learn more about it, is always like a smart route to go.
And something that I've also neglected to address is that this is also a conversation that we have in diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. We're not just talking about the individuals who have may have differences in terms of racism, classism, sexism. We're talking about we're also I feel like in some conversations are neglecting to include the experiences, writings, and even in general the place in society for people who are disabled. There are a lot of individuals that I think that's also a crucial portion of my research, is understanding the place of those individuals in our society and disabled people, and how their experiences may potentially be um, erased because of perpetual inequalities in our society. So it's not just race, class, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation. Those are huge parts of it, especially as someone who is queer and trans. But also in a lot of conversations, we neglect to include those voices as well. And making sure, another step to that is making sure not to talk over people who experience things of that nature, because it's their voices that are silenced. Talking over them is not a very good strategy. Listening to them is the most important. And by reading about their experiences as well, the ones that potentially have been banned or not, is also a good way to educate yourself. Because I say this once, I say this all the time, it's not their responsibility to educate you.
Yeah, and I mean, I definitely agree with like that sentiment, like listening to what people are saying, and especially thank you for bringing that up, because it happens, it completely slipped my mind as well that was another one of those like diversity topics that does tend to end up under the, you know, kind of silence, because like people want to be like, oh well, disabilities just, you know, became a big thing like recently, and it definitely didn't. They were there historically, they were just, you know, ignored even more in a lot worse ways. But yeah, like listening to what diverse like people are saying, and you know, reading what they're saying, or you know, talking to them even, just in regular conversation, I think you learn a lot about like what about diversity, and you know, why it's important, and you know, how their experiences are. Are there any questions on Zoom? Did you have another question? No? Okay. I think that's it.